The German Shepherd's scarred paw reached through the courthouse fence at exactly 3:47 p.m., trembling against the chain link like a prayer made flesh. Margaret O'Brien froze mid-step on the sidewalk, her weathered hand clutching the pharmacy bag containing pills she could barely afford. This wasn't just any dog begging for scraps. This was a decorated canine officer reduced to desperate hope. Mrs. Chen from the courthouse burst through the doors, her usual composure shattered as she stumbled down the steps. "Sweet Jesus!" she gasped, pressing her hand to her chest. "That poor creature's been doing this every single day for 3 weeks." Margaret's throat constricted as she recognized the precise timing. 3:47 p.m. was when her husband Tom used to clock out from his detective shifts, when their world still made sense before that terrible storm 5 years ago. "Someone's got to help him," Margaret whispered, though her own bank account held less than $300. Who had abandoned this hero? And how long would he keep reaching for someone who might never come? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Margaret O'Brien had learned to measure her days in careful increments. 2 cups of coffee instead of 3, generic cereal instead of name brand, and exactly 14 blocks of walking to avoid the courthouse fence where hope lived on borrowed time. At 73, she possessed the sharp mind of a former police psychologist wrapped in the fragile shell of a widow surviving on $1,200 a month. Her small adobe house on Canyon View Drive bore the quiet scars of financial desperation: peeling paint she couldn't afford to refresh, a garden hose patched with electrical tape, and a mortgage payment that consumed half her pension. The medical bills from Tom's final battle with cancer had devoured their savings like a wildfire, leaving her with a paid-off wedding ring and a heart that had learned to love cautiously. Tom O'Brien had been Sedona's finest detective for 28 years, the kind of man who brought home stray cats and never missed their anniversary. His badge sat in her jewelry box now, tarnished but treasured, next to the folded flag from his funeral. The house still smelled faintly of his Old Spice cologne in the bathroom, though she'd stopped replacing the bottle 2 years ago. Every afternoon at 3:30, Margaret walked past Whole Foods toward the library, timing her route to avoid the courthouse at 3:47 p.m. She'd glimpsed the German Shepherd from a distance, a magnificent animal reduced to reaching through chain link, his amber eyes holding the kind of desperate intelligence she'd recognized in trauma victims during her psychology practice. Duke, as the courthouse staff had named him, carried himself with the rigid posture of a trained professional despite his circumstances. His black and tan coat had lost its police dog shine, and a ragged scar split his right ear like a medal of valor gone wrong. The limp in his front paw spoke of service-related injury, the kind that ended careers, but not the need to serve. Detective Ryan Mitchell, 45 and ambitious, had transferred to Sedona 6 months ago under circumstances the department preferred not to discuss. His expensive suits and calculated smile couldn't disguise the hollow look behind his eyes, the expression Margaret had seen in officers who'd compromised their integrity once too often. He drove past the courthouse daily in his black sedan, never slowing, never acknowledging the dog who'd once been his partner. Dr. Sarah Whitfield ran Sedona's only emergency veterinary clinic with the passion of someone who'd chosen animals over the complications of human nature. At 38, she'd seen enough abandoned pets to recognize the difference between strays and the truly lost. Duke fell into a category that broke her heart: the professionally trained, personally discarded. The town itself seemed divided about the courthouse dog. Mrs. Betty Chen, the courthouse clerk, left water bowls and worried aloud about liability issues. The morning coffee crowd at Red Rock Cafe debated whether helping encouraged vagrancy or represented basic human decency. Meanwhile, Duke maintained his vigil, reaching through the fence with a faith that defied logic, waiting for someone who understood that some bonds transcend abandonment. Margaret had spent 5 years perfecting the art of emotional distance, but Duke's daily ritual was slowly unraveling her carefully constructed defenses. The October storm arrived without warning, transforming Sedona's red rocks into bleeding wounds against a bruised sky. Margaret had been returning from the pharmacy when the first fat raindrops splattered against the courthouse steps, each one echoing like gunshots in her memory. 5 years ago, a storm just like this had stolen Tom from her, a routine traffic stop that became a pursuit that became a crash that became the end of everything that mattered. She should have hurried home, should have minded her own business, should have remembered that caring led to losing, and losing led to the kind of pain that hollowed out your chest and left you gasping. Instead, she found herself running toward the courthouse fence where Duke pressed himself against the chain link, his powerful frame shaking as thunder rolled across the desert. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered, watching the German shepherd's amber eyes dart frantically between the darkening sky and the empty parking lot where his partner's car should have been. Duke's scarred paw reached through the fence repeatedly, a desperate semaphore of hope that no one was answering. When the lightning cracked overhead, Duke collapsed. Margaret didn't remember scaling the fence, her arthritic joints protesting every link of chain link she climbed. She didn't remember her house keys cutting into her palm as she gathered 90 pounds of trembling dog into her arms. She only remembered Duke's amber eyes finding hers, wide with the kind of terror she'd seen in Tom's face during those final moments in the hospital. "I've got you," she heard herself saying, the words Tom had whispered to her through 28 years of marriage. "I've got you, and I won't let go. Doctor." Whitfield's emergency clinic occupied a converted ranch house on the outskirts of town, its waiting room decorated with photos of success stories and tissue boxes that never stayed full. At 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, it should have been closed, but Sarah Whitfield had learned to recognize the sound of desperate knocking. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, and acute stress response, Dr. Whitfield announced after her examination, her stethoscope still draped around her neck like a prayer chain. "This dog hasn't eaten properly in weeks. The storm triggered what looks like PTSD. I've seen it in military working dogs and police canines." Margaret sat in the sterile examination room, her soaked cardigan clinging to her shoulders as she processed numbers that might as well have been written in Sanskrit. $847. That was her monthly grocery budget, her prescription co-pays, her small comforts rolled into one impossible sum. "He needs fluids, antibiotics, and a complete blood panel," Dr. Whitfield continued gently. "But Mrs. O'Brien, I have to ask, are you prepared for the financial commitment of caring for a large dog with medical needs?" Margaret opened her purse with trembling fingers, counted out the bills twice, then placed them on the examination table. $234. Everything left after rent, utilities, and Tom's ongoing prescription costs that insurance wouldn't cover. "Will this cover tonight?" she asked, her voice steady despite the earthquake in her chest. Dr. Whitfield's expression softened. "It'll cover the emergency treatment. We can discuss payment plans for the rest." Duke spent the night on IV fluids while Margaret dozed in the clinic's single chair, her hand resting on his massive head. She watched his breathing steady, felt his body temperature return to normal, and wondered when she'd started thinking of him as hers to save. Tom would have laughed at her fiscal irresponsibility, then helped her figure out how to make it work. The next morning brought harsh fluorescent lighting and harsher financial reality. Margaret's bank balance, displayed on her phone screen with clinical precision, $234.67, remaining until next month's pension check. She'd paid Duke's emergency bill with money earmarked for her own prescription refills, a juggling act she'd perfected since becoming a widow on a fixed income. Betty Chen arrived at the courthouse that morning with questions that spread through town faster than wildfire. Where was the dog everyone had grown accustomed to seeing? Who was the elderly woman who'd climbed the fence in a thunderstorm? Was this the same Margaret O'Brien whose husband had been killed in the line of duty 5 years ago? By noon, Margaret's mailbox contained an envelope with no return address and 5 crisp $100 bills inside. No note, no explanation, just enough money to make the impossible slightly more possible. She sat on her front porch, Duke sleeping peacefully on the blanket she'd laid out for him, and wondered if kindness was contagious or if Sedona simply protected its own. Duke's first meal at her house was canned chicken and rice, served in Tom's old cereal bowl because she hadn't owned dog dishes in 15 years. He ate carefully, politely, his amber eyes never leaving her face. When finished, he placed his scarred paw on her knee, not reaching through a fence anymore, but making contact with someone who'd reached back. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous process server who apologized twice before handing Margaret the manila envelope that would change everything. She read the documents 3 times, her coffee growing cold as the reality sank in. Duke wasn't just an abandoned dog seeking help. He was technically stolen property, and Detective Ryan Mitchell wanted him back. Pursuant to Arizona State Law 13-1802, the legal notice read, all police K-9 units remain property of the employing law enforcement agency regardless of retirement status or current location. Failure to return said animal within 30 days may result in criminal charges for theft of government property. Margaret's hands trembled as she set the papers on her kitchen table, where Duke lay sleeping in a shaft of morning sunlight. His breathing was steady now, his coat beginning to regain its former luster after a week of regular meals and medical care. She'd started to believe they'd found each other at exactly the right moment, 2 lonely souls who understood loss and healing. The legal reality felt like a slap across the face of hope. Betty Chen had been talking, of course. The courthouse clerk possessed the town's most efficient information network, and Margaret's midnight rescue during the thunderstorm had provided enough gossip to fuel a month of coffee shop conversations. Someone had mentioned seeing Detective Mitchell's black sedan parked outside the veterinary clinic the day after Duke's collapse, though he'd never come inside. Margaret pulled out her phone and called the one person who might understand the labyrinth of police bureaucracy she was facing. Frank Torres had been Tom's partner for 12 years before retiring to Phoenix, and his gravelly voice still carried the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "Maggie, sweetheart," Frank's voice crackled through the speaker. "I heard about you taking in that K-9. You know that's going to complicate things, right? Frank, they're saying I stole him, but he was abandoned at the courthouse for weeks. Nobody wanted him until I started caring for him." A long pause stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken knowledge. Frank had been investigating police misconduct cases for the state attorney general's office since his retirement, and his silence spoke volumes. "Tell me about this Detective Mitchell," he finally said, "because the paperwork on Duke's retirement doesn't match what I'm hearing on the street." Margaret spent the next hour recounting everything she'd observed. Duke's PTSD responses, his obvious fear when Mitchell's car drove past, the convenient timing of the legal claim. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally making notes she could hear scratching across paper. "Here's what I know," Frank said when she finished. "Duke was involved in an incident 6 months ago that ended his career and got Mitchell transferred out of Phoenix. Official report says the dog failed to apprehend a suspect, resulting in officer injury. But there's another version floating around, one where Mitchell abandoned his post when gunfire started." Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd spent 5 years counseling officers with PTSD, and she recognized the signs of survivor guilt and moral injury. but she'd never considered that Duke might be suffering from his handler's failures rather than his own. "Frank, what aren't you telling me?" "I'm telling you that good dogs don't suddenly become cowards, and scared cops don't always tell the truth in their reports. If Mitchell wants Duke back after 6 months of abandonment, it's because someone's asking questions he doesn't want answered." The conversation ended with Frank promising to make some calls. But Margaret understood that legal battles required resources she didn't possess. 30 days to prove abandonment against a police department with lawyers and documentation. It felt like David facing Goliath, if David were a 73-year-old widow with arthritis and a heart condition. That afternoon, Duke's behavior changed in ways that confirmed Margaret's growing suspicions. During their usual walk past the courthouse, a black sedan identical to Mitchell's drove slowly by. Duke's reaction was immediate and visceral. He pressed against Margaret's legs, whimpering, his entire body trembling with the same terror she'd witnessed during the thunderstorm. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, but Duke's amber eyes tracked the vehicle with the hypervigilance of trauma. This wasn't the behavior of a dog missing his handler. This was fear, pure and primal. Dr. Whitfield confirmed Margaret's observations during Duke's follow-up appointment. His stress responses are consistent with abuse or abandonment by someone he should have been able to trust, she explained while reviewing Duke's blood work. Dogs form powerful bonds with their handlers. When those bonds are broken through betrayal or neglect, the psychological damage can be profound. "Could he testify?" Margaret asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. "Not in court," Dr. Whitfield smiled sadly. "But his behavior patterns tell a story that any trained observer could interpret. The question is whether anyone will listen to what he's saying." Margaret returned home to find another anonymous envelope in her mailbox, this one containing $1,000 and a note written in careful cursive. "Some battles are worth fighting. A friend who understands." She sat on her front porch, Duke's massive head resting on her feet, and realized she was no longer facing this fight alone. The money felt like validation, proof that others recognized the injustice of Mitchell's claim, but it also represented something more dangerous: hope. Margaret had learned to live without hope, to expect disappointment and plan for loss. Hope was what had made Tom's death so devastating, what had turned her comfortable life into a careful existence measured in dollars and avoided emotional risks. Duke lifted his scarred head and looked at her with those intelligent amber eyes, as if reading her thoughts. His paw came up to rest on her knee, not reaching through a fence anymore, but making contact with someone who'd reached back and chosen to stay. 23 days remained on the legal deadline, but Margaret O'Brien was no longer counting down to surrender. She was counting down to a fight that would determine whether love and loyalty meant anything in a world governed by paperwork and power. The Red Rock Cafe buzzed with the kind of small-town energy that transformed morning coffee into community theater. Margaret sat in the corner booth she'd claimed as headquarters for her investigation, surrounded by manila folders, legal pads, and the determined faces of unlikely allies. Betty Chen clutched her third cup of coffee while scrolling through courthouse records on her tablet. Her usual gossip network transformed into a research operation. "Here's what doesn't make sense," Betty announced, adjusting her reading glasses. "Duke's retirement paperwork is dated 6 months ago, but there's no documentation of where he went after leaving active duty. Usually K-9s either go home with their handlers or get transferred to other departments. Duke just disappeared from the system." Dr. Whitfield leaned forward, her veterinary expertise adding weight to the discussion. "I've treated retired police dogs before. The department typically ensures proper medical transition and follows up on their well-being. Duke showed up at that courthouse fence malnourished and untreated for obvious PTSD symptoms. That's not standard protocol." Margaret spread the timeline across the table like pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve. 6 months ago, Duke's mysterious retirement and Mitchell's transfer to Sedona. 4 months ago, first reported sightings of a German shepherd sleeping behind the courthouse. 3 weeks ago, Duke's daily vigil at the fence began. The gaps in documentation were as revealing as the facts themselves. Frank Torres arrived from Phoenix carrying a briefcase that suggested serious business. His weathered face bore the expression Margaret remembered from Tom's most complex cases, the look of a man who'd uncovered something significant and troubling. "Ladies," he began, settling his bulk into the booth's vinyl seat, "I've been making calls, and what I found isn't pretty." Mitchell's incident report from 6 months ago has more holes than a screen door. He pulled out a thick folder, spreading photocopied documents across the table. Official version: armed robbery in progress, suspect fleeing on foot. Mitchell and Duke in pursuit. Dog failed to apprehend subject, who then fired on officers. Mitchell wounded, suspect escaped. Margaret studied the police photos, noting the timestamps and locations. Something felt wrong about the sequence of events, though she couldn't articulate what bothered her. "Here's the unofficial version," Frank continued, lowering his voice. 3 witnesses put Mitchell's patrol car 2 blocks away from the action when the shooting started. Security camera from a nearby business shows Duke pursuing the suspect alone while Mitchell remained in his vehicle. The implications hit Margaret like ice water. Duke hadn't failed in his duty. He'd been abandoned by a coward who then rewrote history to save his career. Betty Chen gasped audibly. "That poor animal was doing his job while his partner hid in the car?" "Gets worse," Frank said grimly. Mitchell received a commendation for bravery under fire. Duke got early retirement due to performance issues that endangered officer safety. The hero became the scapegoat. Dr. Whitfield's professional composure cracked. No wonder his PTSD is so severe. He was betrayed by the person he trusted most, then blamed for the consequences of that betrayal. Margaret felt rage building in her chest. Not the helpless anger of grief, but the focused fury of someone who'd found a cause worth fighting for. Tom had taught her to recognize injustice and never look away from it, even when confronting it seemed impossible. "Frank, can we prove any of this in court?" The security footage went missing 2 days after the incident. Witnesses were never officially interviewed. Mitchell's story is all that made it into the final report. Frank's expression grew darker. But here's the interesting part. Mitchell's been making noise about getting Duke back ever since word got out that you'd taken him in. Suddenly, after 6 months of abandonment, he's demanding return of valuable department property. The cafe had grown quiet around them, other patrons unconsciously leaning in to catch fragments of conversation that would fuel speculation for weeks. Margaret realized they'd crossed a line from private concern into public battle, with Duke's fate hanging in the balance. "Why now?" Margaret asked. "What changed?" Frank pulled out his phone, showing them a Facebook page titled Justice for Duke. The page had gained 12,000 followers in 3 days, sharing Duke's story with hashtags like K9Hero and #abandoned by the badge. Comments ranged from outraged support to detailed accounts of similar incidents nationwide. "Mitchell's getting attention he doesn't want. Department's getting pressure from animal welfare groups and veteran organizations. My guess is they want Duke back under their control before more people start asking uncomfortable questions." Betty Chen had gone pale, her usual chatter replaced by stunned silence. "All this time, we thought he was just another stray looking for handouts. He was a war hero trying to understand why his partner abandoned him." Margaret watched Duke through the cafe's window, where he waited patiently beside her car. His posture remained alert despite his trauma, ready to serve and protect even after being discarded like obsolete equipment. The sight strengthened her resolve beyond any legal argument or financial consideration. "How much time do we have?" she asked Frank. 17 days until the legal deadline. But Margaret, you need to understand what you're up against. Police departments protect their own, even the corrupt ones. They have resources, lawyers, and institutional power. All you have is the truth, Margaret interrupted, and Duke's story, and people who still believe that matters. Dr. Whitfield leaned back in her seat, medical expertise mixing with moral conviction. I can document Duke's condition when he arrived, the malnutrition, untreated injuries, psychological trauma. Any competent veterinarian would recognize signs of prolonged abandonment. I can pull courthouse surveillance footage showing how long he was there unattended, Betty Chen added, her clerical skills transformed into weapons of advocacy. Frank nodded approvingly. And I can connect you with other officers who were asking questions about Mitchell's story. Not everyone in law enforcement is willing to cover for cowards. Margaret felt the familiar sensation of pieces clicking into place, the same feeling she'd experienced during complex psychology cases when seemingly random behaviors suddenly revealed their underlying logic. Duke's daily vigil at exactly 3:47 p.m. wasn't random. It was the time Mitchell's shift typically ended, the time when his partner should have come home. He was waiting for Mitchell, she realized aloud. Every single day, at the exact time he expected his partner to arrive. Even after being abandoned, he maintained faith that Mitchell would return for him. The revelation brought tears to Betty Chen's eyes and silence to the cafe. Duke's loyalty in the face of betrayal represented something pure in a world increasingly defined by cynicism and self-interest. That settles it, Margaret announced, gathering the documents with newfound determination. They want a legal battle. They'll get one. But this isn't about property rights or department policies anymore. This is about honoring the sacrifice of someone who served faithfully and was repaid with abandonment. Frank's expression mixed admiration with concern. Margaret, this could get expensive. Court costs, legal fees, expert witnesses. Frank Torres. Did you know my husband for 28 years without learning that some fights are worth everything you have to give? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Frank's slow smile indicated he'd found his answer. Tom O'Brien had never backed down from defending the innocent, and his widow wasn't about to start now. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Margaret noticed the other patrons watching with expressions of support and curiosity. Word would spread through Sedona within hours. The police widow was taking on the police department, and the stakes were higher than anyone had imagined. Duke rose from his patient wait as Margaret approached her car, his amber eyes bright with the intelligence that had made him an exemplary K-9 officer. His scarred paw reached toward her, not desperately through a fence anymore, but confidently toward someone who'd proven worthy of his trust. "Ready to go home, boy?" she asked, scratching behind his damaged ear. Duke's tail wagged once, a measured response that spoke of healing hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together. The Sedona courthouse had never seen drama quite like the custody hearing for Duke, where every seat in the gallery was occupied by townspeople who'd transformed a legal proceeding into a moral referendum. Judge Patricia Hayes, 65 and granite-faced from 30 years on the bench, surveyed the packed courtroom with the measured gaze of someone accustomed to human folly, but still occasionally surprised by its depth. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table wearing her best navy dress, the same one she'd worn to Tom's funeral, with Duke lying calmly at her feet. His presence violated courtroom protocol, but Judge Hayes had granted the exception after Dr. Whitfield testified that separating them would cause severe psychological distress to both parties. Duke's amber eyes remained fixed on Margaret's face, ignoring the crowd and cameras that had transformed his fate into a media spectacle. Detective Ryan Mitchell occupied the defendant's table in his dress uniform, ribbons and badges gleaming under fluorescent lights that made his pale complexion appear almost ghostly. His department-issued lawyer, a sharp-suited woman named Catherine Ross, shuffled through folders thick with legal precedents and property statutes. The optics were undeniably stark. Decorated officer versus elderly widow, institutional authority versus individual compassion. Your Honor, Attorney Ross began during opening statements, this case concerns the illegal appropriation of valuable government property. K-9 Duke was trained at taxpayer expense, served with distinction for 6 years, and remains the legal property of the Phoenix Police Department, Ms. Caw. O'Brien's emotional attachment, while understandable, cannot supersede established law regarding police assets. The argument was legally sound and morally bankrupt, delivered with the cold precision of someone who'd learned to separate law from justice. Margaret watched Mitchell during his attorney's presentation, noting how he avoided eye contact with Duke despite sitting only 15 feet away. When Margaret's turn came, she stood without notes or prepared remarks, speaking directly to Judge Hayes with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades analyzing human behavior. Your Honor, Duke wasn't abandoned property. He was a faithful partner discarded when his loyalty became inconvenient. For 3 weeks, he maintained vigil at that courthouse fence, reaching out to everyone who passed, believing that someone who cared about his service and sacrifice would eventually notice. The law may define him as property, but his actions define him as family. The first witness was Dr. Whitfield, whose veterinary expertise provided clinical foundation for emotional arguments. She presented photographs of Duke's condition upon arrival: 20 pounds underweight, untreated injuries on his paws from weeks on concrete, and stress-related digestive issues consistent with prolonged anxiety. In my professional opinion, Dr. Whitfield testified, Duke exhibited classic symptoms of abandonment trauma. His attachment to Mrs. O'Brien isn't simply gratitude. It's the behavioral response of an animal who found safety after extended psychological distress. Attorney Ross's cross-examination attempted to reduce Duke's condition to normal aging rather than neglect, but Dr. Whitfield's expertise proved unshakable. She'd documented every aspect of Duke's recovery with scientific precision, creating an irrefutable timeline of healing that coincided exactly with Margaret's care. Frank Torres took the witness stand wearing his best suit and the weathered confidence of someone who'd testified in hundreds of cases. His investigation had uncovered inconsistencies in Mitchell's incident report that cast serious doubt on the official narrative of Duke's retirement. The timeline doesn't match, Frank explained, consulting his notes. Officer Mitchell reported being injured while attempting to assist his K-9 partner in apprehending an armed suspect. But witness statements place his patrol car 2 blocks away when the shooting began. Security footage from nearby businesses, the footage that mysteriously disappeared, would have confirmed Duke pursuing the suspect alone. Margaret watched Mitchell's face during Frank's testimony, noting the telltale signs of deception she'd learned to recognize during her psychology career: micro-expressions of guilt, defensive posturing, the inability to maintain eye contact when confronted with uncomfortable truths. Mr. Torres, Attorney Ross interjected during cross-examination, you're presenting hearsay and speculation rather than verified evidence. My client's service record speaks for itself. 6 years of exemplary performance, multiple commendations, promotion to detective following the incident in question. Frank's response carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Ma'am, I've been investigating police misconduct for 5 years since retirement. Records can be modified, witnesses can be discouraged, and promotions can be political rewards for silence. But dogs don't lie about who they trust and who they fear. Betty Chen's testimony provided the timeline that converted suspicion into documentation. Courthouse security cameras had recorded Duke's arrival and daily routine with bureaucratic precision, creating an unassailable record of abandonment that no legal argument could explain away. "He appeared behind the courthouse approximately 4 months ago," Betty explained, consulting her meticulously kept logs. "Initially, he stayed hidden during business hours, only emerging after staff departed. 3 weeks ago, his behavior changed. He began positioning himself at the fence during peak foot traffic, extending his paw toward passers-by." Judge Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest. "Mrs. Chen, in your observation, was Duke's behavior consistent with a lost animal seeking its owner or an abandoned animal seeking help?" Betty's answer was delivered with the certainty of someone who'd witnessed every moment of Duke's vigil. "Your Honor, he wasn't looking for anyone specific. He was reaching out to everyone, hoping someone would care enough to help." The prosecution's case crumbled during Mitchell's own testimony, when his carefully rehearsed narrative encountered the reality of Duke's presence in the courtroom. As Mitchell described Duke as property requiring proper handling by trained professionals, Duke's reaction was immediate and visceral. He pressed against Margaret's legs, whimpering softly with the same terror she'd witnessed during thunderstorms. "Detective Mitchell," Judge Hayes observed, "the animal appears distressed by your presence. Can you explain this reaction in an animal you claim to have worked with professionally for 6 years?" Mitchell's stammered response about improper bonding with unauthorized handlers convinced no one, least of all the judge who'd spent 3 decades distinguishing truth from fabrication. The turning point came when Frank Torres presented his final piece of evidence. A sworn affidavit from Officer Rebecca Santos, Mitchell's former colleague who'd been present during the incident that ended Duke's career. "Officer Santos was initially reluctant to come forward," Frank explained, "but Duke's story convinced her that silence serves no one except those who abuse their authority." The affidavit detailed Mitchell's pattern of avoiding dangerous situations, his habit of allowing his K-9 partner to assume risks he wouldn't take himself, and most damning, his practice of claiming credit for Duke's successful apprehensions while blaming the dog for any complications. "According to Officer Santos," Frank continued, "Duke saved 3 civilian lives during the incident that supposedly ended his career. He continued pursuing an armed suspect after his handler took cover, preventing what could have been a tragic shooting in a crowded area." Margaret felt vindication and heartbreak in equal measure, vindication for Duke's heroism, heartbreak for the injustice he'd endured. She reached down to touch his scarred ear, and Duke's amber eyes met hers with the profound trust of someone who'd finally found their person. Judge Hayes called for recess, but the damage to Mitchell's case was irreparable. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations and barely contained outrage as the truth of Duke's abandonment became undeniable. During the break, Margaret sat with Duke in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by supporters who'd driven from across Arizona to witness what had become a symbol of loyalty versus expedience, truth versus convenience. "Whatever happens," she whispered to Duke, "you're not property. You're family. And family doesn't abandon each other." Duke's response was to place his scarred paw in her hand, not reaching through a fence anymore, but making contact with someone who'd reached back and chosen to stay. When court resumed, Judge Hayes's expression suggested she'd reached a decision that would satisfy justice, even if it complicated legal precedent. Judge Hayes returned from recess with the measured deliberation of someone who'd spent 30 years balancing law with justice, but her preliminary ruling felt like a devastating blow to everything Margaret had fought to prove. The courtroom fell silent as she reviewed the legal precedents that governed police K-9 ownership, each statute reading like a nail in the coffin of hope. While this court is deeply moved by the testimony regarding Duke's exemplary service and Mrs. O'Brien's compassionate care, Judge Hayes began, her voice carrying the weight of reluctant legal obligation. Arizona state law is unambiguous regarding the ownership of police working animals. K-9 units remain government property regardless of retirement circumstances or current caretaker arrangements. Margaret felt the words hit her like physical blows, each legal phrase dismantling the emotional case she'd built around Duke's heroism and abandonment. The packed courtroom erupted in murmurs of disbelief and anger, but Judge Hayes continued with the inexorable logic of statute and precedent. Furthermore, the judge added, consulting her notes with obvious distaste, the court cannot establish legal abandonment without clear documentation of intent to relinquish ownership. Detective Mitchell's claim that Duke was temporarily displaced rather than permanently discarded creates reasonable doubt regarding abandonment charges. Duke, sensing the shift in energy, pressed closer to Margaret's legs with the intuitive understanding animals possess about human distress. His amber eyes remained fixed on her face, trusting her to navigate this incomprehensible world of legal abstractions that threatened to separate them once again. Attorney Ross rose with barely concealed triumph, addressing the court with the cold satisfaction of someone who'd won through technicality rather than truth. Your Honor, the Phoenix Police Department appreciates the court's recognition of established property law. We're prepared to arrange immediate transfer of the K-9 unit back to proper departmental custody. The words K-9 unit, rather than Duke, felt like deliberate dehumanization, reducing a hero to inventory. Margaret watched Mitchell during his attorney's moment of victory, noting how he avoided looking at Duke despite sitting mere feet away from his former partner. However, Judge Hayes continued, raising her hand to silence the courtroom's growing agitation, this court also recognizes extraordinary circumstances that merit consideration beyond strict legal interpretation. The testimony regarding Duke's medical needs, psychological trauma, and demonstrated attachment to Ms. O'Brien raises serious questions about animal welfare that transcend property rights. A spark of hope flickered in Margaret's chest, though she tried to suppress it. Tom had taught her that legal proceedings often contained surprises until the final gavel fell, and she'd learned to steel herself against disappointment. Therefore, Judge Hayes announced, this court orders a 30-day medical evaluation period during which Duke will remain in Ms. O'Brien's care while veterinary and psychological experts assess his fitness for return to active duty or institutional care. The ruling felt like being thrown a life preserver while drowning, temporary relief that came with the terrifying knowledge that the water remained treacherous. Margaret understood she'd won a month to prove Duke's need for specialized care, but the fundamental legal reality remained unchanged. As court adjourned, Margaret found herself surrounded by supporters whose outrage exceeded her own emotional capacity for processing the day's events. Betty Chen clutched her arm with fierce loyalty, while Dr. Whitfield discussed the medical documentation they'd need to build an irrefutable case for Duke's special needs. But Margaret's attention focused entirely on Duke, whose behavior had shifted dramatically during the judge's ruling. His usual calm composure gave way to restless pacing and occasional whimpers, signs she recognized as stress responses to uncertainty and potential separation. That evening, Margaret sat on her front porch watching Duke patrol her small yard with the hyper-vigilant energy of someone preparing for loss. His routine of investigating every sound and shadow reflected the psychological impact of a day spent as the subject of legal debate rather than the recipient of unconditional care. "It's going to be okay, boy," she whispered, though her own certainty wavered. "We've got 30 days to show them you belong here." Duke approached her chair and placed his scarred paw on her knee, the gesture that had become their private language of trust and reassurance. But tonight his amber eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there since his early days of recovery. The local news coverage that evening transformed Duke's case into a statewide symbol of bureaucratic callousness versus individual compassion. Social media exploded with hashtag justice for Duke hashtags and donations to Margaret's legal defense fund, but she understood that public opinion couldn't overcome legal precedent. Dr. Whitfield arrived the next morning with comprehensive plans for documenting Duke's psychological needs during the evaluation period. Her veterinary expertise would be crucial in establishing medical necessity for specialized care that only Margaret could provide. We need to demonstrate that Duke's PTSD requires consistency and stability that institutional care cannot offer, Dr. Whitfield explained while examining Duke's stress responses. His attachment to you isn't just emotional, it's therapeutic. Separation would constitute medical malpractice. Margaret watched Duke's behavior throughout the examination, noting how his anxiety decreased when she remained in the room but spiked whenever she stepped away. The bond they'd formed transcended pet ownership. It represented mutual healing between two trauma survivors who'd found solace in each other's company. But their temporary victory came with an unexpected cost that arrived in Margaret's mailbox that afternoon. The medical evaluation period had triggered provisions in her homeowner's insurance policy regarding dangerous animals and liability concerns. Her premium would triple immediately, or coverage would be canceled within 10 days. Margaret stared at the insurance notice while calculating impossible mathematics. Her monthly pension barely covered existing expenses, and the addition of $400 in insurance costs would require choices between medication and food. The financial pressure felt like another form of legal warfare designed to make Duke's care unsustainable. That evening brought another anonymous envelope containing $2,000 and a note written in the same careful cursive, "Heroes deserve better than bureaucracy. Fight for him." The mysterious benefactor had been monitoring developments and providing exactly the support needed when circumstances seemed most hopeless. Margaret held the money while Duke settled beside her chair, his massive head resting on her feet with the trusting weight of someone who'd found their person. She thought about Tom's unwavering belief that doing right mattered more than doing easy, and how Duke embodied that same principle through his continued faith in humanity despite being betrayed by those he'd served. The phone rang at 9:30 p.m., unusually late for Margaret's social circle. Frank Torres's voice carried troubling news that threatened to unravel everything they'd accomplished. "Margaret, I've been hearing rumors from Phoenix that concern me. Mitchell's been making noise about Duke being dangerous, about your age making you an unsuitable caretaker. He's building a narrative that paints you as an unstable elderly woman who's anthropomorphizing a traumatized animal." The accusations felt like character assassination designed to undermine the medical evaluation before it could begin. Margaret understood that Mitchell's desperation to control the narrative suggested fear of what the evaluation might reveal about his own failures as Duke's handler. "Frank, what can we do about rumors and innuendo?" "Document everything. Duke's behavior, your interactions, his progress during recovery. Make the medical evaluation so thorough that no one can question his need for specialized care." Margaret hung up the phone with growing dread about the battles ahead. The 30-day reprieve was beginning to feel like prolonged torture rather than opportunity for redemption. Duke lifted his head from her feet and looked at her with those intelligent amber eyes that had seen the worst of human nature yet still believed in the possibility of goodness. His scarred paw reached toward her hand, not desperately through offense anymore, but confidently toward someone who'd proven worthy of his trust. "We're going to fight, boy," Margaret whispered, scratching behind his damaged ear. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, we're going to show them that some bonds matter more than paperwork." Duke's tail wagged once, a measured response that spoke of healing hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. The medical evaluation would determine his future, but Margaret understood that the real battle was for recognition that love and loyalty couldn't be reduced to property law and institutional convenience. 29 days remained to prove that Duke belonged with her, and Margaret O'Brien had never faced a more important fight in her 73 years of living. The microchip discovery happened by accident during Duke's routine medical examination, when Dr. Whitfield's scanner detected an unexpected secondary signal beneath his standard identification chip. Her expression shifted from professional routine to stunned disbelief as she read the encrypted data that had been hidden in Duke's neck for 6 months, waiting for someone to look carefully enough to find it. "Margaret, you need to see this," Dr. Whitfield whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of revelation. The scanner's screen displayed video files, incident reports, and audio recordings, a complete digital archive that Duke had been carrying like a secret testament to truth. The backup footage was devastating in its clarity. Margaret watched Detective Ryan Mitchell abandon his patrol car 2 blocks from the armed robbery, leaving Duke to pursue 3 armed suspects alone through a crowded shopping district. The timestamp showed Mitchell retreating to safety while his partner continued advancing toward gunfire, positioning himself between civilians and an active shooter. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret breathed, watching Duke tackle one gunman while the other 2 fled. The video showed no failure, no hesitation, no cowardice, only a heroic animal doing his job while his handler cowered in safety 300 yards away. But the revelations grew more horrifying as additional files loaded. Mitchell had arrived at the scene 20 minutes after Duke single-handedly prevented a mass shooting, then radioed for backup, claiming he and his K-9 unit were taking fire from multiple suspects. The audio recording captured Mitchell's deliberate falsification of events in real time. Dr. Whitfield's hands shook as she accessed the final files, internal affairs interviews that had never made it into official records. 3 witnesses had tried to report Mitchell's abandonment of his post, but their statements had been buried under departmental politics and Mitchell's connections within the command structure. Duke was carrying the evidence of his own exoneration, Dr. Whitfield realized. Someone programmed this chip as insurance, knowing that the truth would eventually need to surface. Margaret felt rage and vindication warring in her chest as she understood the full scope of Duke's betrayal. He hadn't just been abandoned, he'd been deliberately scapegoated to protect a coward's career. The hero had become the villain in an elaborate cover-up that stretched through multiple levels of law enforcement hierarchy. Frank Torres arrived within an hour, his expression grim as he reviewed the digital evidence that would destroy Mitchell's credibility and potentially expose departmental corruption. "This changes everything, Margaret. With this footage, we can prove abandonment, false reporting, and conspiracy to cover up misconduct." But their moment of triumph was interrupted by a phone call that threatened to unravel everything they discovered. Mitchell's attorney had filed an emergency motion claiming Duke posed imminent danger to public safety based on his deteriorating psychological condition. The motion requested immediate seizure and potential euthanization for the safety of the community. "They're panicking," Frank realized, reading the legal documents. "Someone knows we're close to exposing the truth, and they're trying to eliminate Duke before he can testify through his behavior." Margaret felt ice water replace the blood in her veins. The legal system that should have protected Duke was being weaponized against him by the very people who'd destroyed his career and abandoned him to die. The microchip evidence wouldn't matter if Duke was seized and destroyed before it could be presented in court. Dr. Whitfield's professional composure cracked completely. "They can't euthanize a healthy animal based on false psychological assessments. I won't allow it." "They can if they control the narrative," Frank replied grimly. Mitchell's been building a case that Duke is unstable, dangerous, and deteriorating under Margaret's care. They'll use the emergency powers provisions to bypass normal legal protections. Margaret looked at Duke, who lay peacefully in the veterinary examination room, unaware that his life hung in the balance of legal maneuvering and political expediency. His amber eyes reflected the trust of someone who believed that truth and loyalty mattered, that service and sacrifice meant something in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to both. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following morning, giving them less than 18 hours to prepare a defense against accusations they'd never anticipated. Mitchell's strategy had shifted from reclaiming property to eliminating evidence, and Duke had become collateral damage in a battle for institutional credibility. "We need character witnesses," Frank announced, already making phone calls. "People who've interacted with Duke since he's been in Margaret's care. We need to prove his psychological stability and demonstrate that the emergency motion is malicious rather than medical." Betty Chen rallied the courthouse staff who'd observed Duke's daily vigil and subsequent transformation under Margaret's care. Their testimonies would establish Duke's gentle nature and progressive healing, contradicting Mitchell's claims of dangerous instability. Dr. Whitfield prepared comprehensive medical documentation showing Duke's improvement in every measurable category: weight gain, stress reduction, decreased PTSD episodes, and increased social engagement. Her veterinary expertise would counter any claims about psychological deterioration. But Margaret understood that their strongest defense was Duke himself. His behavior in courtroom settings had been impeccable, showing no signs of aggression or instability even under the stress of legal proceedings. The contrast between Mitchell's claims and Duke's actual conduct would speak louder than any expert testimony. The night before the emergency hearing, Margaret sat with Duke in her living room, surrounded by legal documents and medical records that documented their journey from strangers to family. The microchip evidence lay on her coffee table like a smoking gun that could vindicate Duke's heroism, but might come too late to save his life. "I'm sorry, boy," she whispered, stroking Duke's scarred ear. "I thought saving you from that fence was the hard part. I didn't know they'd try to destroy you for telling the truth." Duke lifted his massive head and placed his paw in her hand, not reaching desperately through a fence anymore, but making contact with someone who'd reached back and refused to let go. His amber eyes held the same trust they'd carried since their first meeting, despite learning that human institutions could be as cruel as human individuals. The phone rang at midnight, bringing news that would change everything about tomorrow's hearing. Mitchell had suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown, barricading himself in his apartment and making threats against Duke, Margaret, and anyone who'd supported their case. "SWAT team is en route," Frank reported over the phone. "Mitchell's been ranting about conspiracies and cover-ups, claiming Duke is somehow orchestrating his downfall. He's clearly experiencing a severe mental health crisis." Margaret felt no satisfaction in Mitchell's collapse, only sadness for a man who'd destroyed himself through cowardice and lies. Duke's vindication was coming at the cost of human tragedy, proving that the truth often wounded everyone it touched. The emergency hearing proceeded the next morning without Mitchell's presence, his attorney withdrawing the dangerous animal motion while explaining her client's temporary incapacitation due to stress-related illness. Judge Hayes reviewed the microchip evidence with obvious amazement, her expression shifting from skepticism to outrage as she understood the scope of Duke's mistreatment. "This court has reviewed compelling evidence that fundamentally alters our understanding of the K-9 unit's service record and subsequent abandonment," Judge Hayes announced. "Detective Mitchell's claims regarding this animal's psychological instability appear to be projection of his own untreated trauma and guilt." Margaret watched Duke during the judge's ruling, noting how his posture relaxed as the courtroom atmosphere shifted from adversarial to supportive. He seemed to understand that the truth had finally emerged, that his heroism was being recognized rather than buried under false narratives. Furthermore, Judge Hayes continued, the evidence suggests that Duke's retirement was based on fabricated reports designed to conceal officer misconduct rather than any failure in canine performance. This constitutes abandonment in the legal sense, regardless of departmental ownership policies. The courtroom erupted in applause as Judge Hayes awarded permanent custody to Margaret, ruling that Duke's medical and psychological needs could only be met through continued specialized care. The hero who'd reached through a courthouse fence seeking help had found not just a home, but justice. Duke's tail wagged as Margaret knelt beside him, his scarred paw reaching toward her face in a gesture of gratitude and love. The microchip that had preserved the truth of his heroism would be removed, but the evidence of his courage would live forever in the hearts of those who'd witnessed his unwavering faith in human goodness. 6 months after the gavel fell in Judge Hayes's courtroom, Margaret O'Brien found herself standing in the same spot where she'd first discovered Duke reaching through the courthouse fence, but everything had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The chain-link barrier remained, but now it served as a memorial garden where visitors left flowers, dog treats, and handwritten notes, thanking Duke for his service and Margaret for her courage. Duke sat beside her in the autumn sunshine, his coat gleaming with health and his amber eyes bright with contentment. The scarred ear that had once marked him as damaged goods now served as a badge of honor, a visible reminder of service and sacrifice that the community had learned to celebrate rather than pity. His daily routine no longer included desperate reaching through fences, but rather purposeful walks through Sedona's neighborhoods where children waved and adults stopped to share their own stories of rescue and redemption. The transformation hadn't been limited to Duke's physical recovery. Margaret had discovered that saving him had simultaneously saved herself from the slow dissolution of grief and isolation. Her small adobe house had become an informal headquarters for retired service animal advocacy, with boxes of correspondence from across the nation seeking guidance for similar cases of abandonment and bureaucratic indifference. "Mrs. O'Brien," Betty Chen called from the courthouse steps, waving a manila envelope with obvious excitement. "The package from Washington arrived." Margaret accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, recognizing the congressional seal that marked the culmination of months of testimony and advocacy work. Inside was the signed legislation known as Duke's Law, establishing federal protections for retired military and police working animals and creating oversight mechanisms to prevent future abandonment cases. Duke seemed to sense the importance of the moment, pressing against Margaret's legs with the protective instinct that had made him an exemplary K-9 officer. His presence grounded her as she read the letter from Senator Patricia Morrison, who'd championed the legislation after hearing Duke's story during a Veterans Affairs Committee hearing. "Your courage in fighting for Duke has created a legacy that will protect thousands of service animals for generations to come," the letter read. "Heroes deserve better than abandonment, and your refusal to accept institutional indifference has ensured they'll receive it." Dr. Whitfield approached from her veterinary clinic across the street, carrying the quarterly medical report that documented Duke's continued progress. His PTSD episodes had decreased by 80%. His weight had stabilized at optimal levels, and his socialization scores indicated complete psychological recovery from the trauma of abandonment and betrayal. "I've never seen such a complete transformation," Dr. Whitfield marveled, watching Duke greet her with the calm confidence of an animal who'd found his place in the world. 6 months ago, he was dying of neglect and despair. Today, he's healthier than most dogs half his age. Margaret smiled, remembering the terrified creature she'd pulled from the courthouse fence during that October thunderstorm. Duke's recovery had paralleled her own journey from isolated widow to reluctant activist to nationally recognized advocate for animal welfare rights. Frank Torres arrived in his familiar pickup truck, stepping out with the satisfied expression of someone whose investigation had exposed corruption and delivered justice. His work on Duke's case had led to a broader inquiry into police department practices regarding K-9 unit management, resulting in policy reforms and disciplinary actions that stretched far beyond Sedona. Mitchell's plea agreement was finalized yesterday, Frank reported, settling onto a nearby bench where Duke immediately claimed space beside him. 2 years probation, mandatory psychological counseling, and permanent disqualification from law enforcement positions. He also agreed to public testimony supporting Duke's law implementation. Margaret felt no vindictive pleasure in Mitchell's downfall, only sadness for a man whose cowardice had cost him everything while nearly destroying an innocent animal. She'd visited him once during his rehabilitation program, hoping to demonstrate forgiveness and encourage his recovery. Duke had accompanied her, showing no fear or aggression toward his former handler, a grace that had reduced Mitchell to tears of shame and gratitude. "He asked me to give you this," Frank continued, handing Margaret a handwritten letter. Mitchell's confession was painfully honest, acknowledging his abandonment of Duke and accepting responsibility for the cover-up that had followed. The letter concluded with a pledge to spend the remainder of his life supporting animal welfare organizations as penance for his failures. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors when a charter bus pulled up to the courthouse, discharging 30 members of the National Police K-9 Association who'd driven from Phoenix to honor Duke's service. Their ceremony was simple but profound, a formal recognition of Duke's heroism during the shopping center incident, complete with citations that should have been awarded 6 months earlier. K-9 Duke served with exceptional valor, placing civilian safety above personal welfare and continuing his mission despite being abandoned by his handler, the citation read. His actions prevented multiple casualties and exemplify the finest traditions of police service. Margaret watched Duke accept the honor with dignified composure, his tail wagging as uniformed officers lined up to shake her hand and pay their respects. The contrast with his treatment by institutional authorities 6 months earlier was stark and gratifying. As evening approached, the crowd began to disperse, leaving Margaret and Duke alone at the fence where their story had begun. The setting sun painted Sedona's red rocks in shades of gold and amber that matched Duke's eyes, creating a perfect backdrop for reflection on how far they'd traveled together. "You know what the best part is?" Margaret asked Duke, scratching behind his scarred ear. "It was never about winning a legal case or changing laws or getting recognition. It was about you reaching out and me reaching back. Everything else was just consequences of that choice." Duke's response was to place his paw in her hand, not desperately through a fence anymore, but confidently with someone who'd proven worthy of his trust. The gesture had become their private language, a daily affirmation that love and loyalty transcended bureaucracy and institutional indifference. The anonymous benefactor who'd supported their fight finally revealed herself that evening when Eleanor Martinez, a retired police widow from Tucson, arrived with a cashier's check for $50,000 to establish the Duke Foundation for Retired Service Animals. Her husband had been killed in the line of duty, and Duke's story had reminded her that honoring the fallen required caring for the living. "Heroes come in all forms," Eleanor explained, watching Duke demonstrate the basic commands that proved his continued fitness despite institutional abandonment. "Some wear badges, some wear fur, but they all deserve our gratitude and protection when their service ends." Margaret's small house had evolved into an informal sanctuary where 3 other retired K-9s now lived alongside Duke, each rescued from abandonment or neglect through the network of advocates that Duke's case had inspired. The mortgage she'd nearly lost to medical bills was now paid in full through donations from supporters who understood that saving one life often meant saving many. As night fell over Sedona, Margaret sat on her front porch with Duke at her feet and reflected on the unexpected turns that had transformed her twilight years from quiet decline into purposeful mission. Tom would have been proud of her courage, she knew, but more importantly, he would have understood that Duke had given her something precious, the chance to matter again. Duke lifted his head from her feet and looked toward the courthouse fence, where a security light illuminated the memorial garden that bore his name. His amber eyes held no sadness or longing, only the contentment of an animal who'd found his people and his purpose. "Ready to go home, boy?" Margaret asked, rising from her chair with joints that protested less than they had 6 months ago. Purpose, she'd discovered, was better medicine than prescription drugs. Duke stood with the fluid grace of a healthy animal, his tail wagging once in measured response. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was a feeling of belonging, of being valued, of reaching out and finding someone who reached back. As they walked toward the house together, Margaret marveled at the simple truth that had changed both their lives. Sometimes the ones who reach out to everyone are really reaching for just one person who will reach back. Duke had found that person in an unlikely savior who'd needed saving herself. Now the courthouse fence stood empty now, but its legacy lived on in legislation, in lives saved, and in the unshakable truth that love conquers abandonment, courage defeats cowardice, and heroes deserve better than bureaucratic indifference. Duke's story had ended where it began, with reaching out and finding connection, but the reaching now flowed both ways, creating bonds that no institution could break and no authority could dissolve. They were home. At 73, Margaret O'Brien thought her story was over. Widowed, struggling on a fixed income, watching life pass by from the safety of emotional distance. Then Duke reached through that courthouse fence, not just seeking help, but offering something she'd forgotten existed. The chance to matter again. Like so many of us who've reached our golden years, Margaret had learned to measure life in careful increments, avoiding risks that might lead to heartbreak. But Duke's unwavering faith in human goodness reminded her that our greatest chapters often begin when we think the book is closed. Their bond transcended the typical pet-owner relationship. It became a partnership between two souls who'd been discarded by systems that should have protected them. Margaret's courage to fight institutional indifference didn't just save Duke. It saved herself from the slow fade of purposelessness that haunts too many seniors. At an age when society expects us to step aside, Margaret stepped forward, proving that our accumulated wisdom, fierce loyalty, and refusal to accept injustice are exactly what the world needs most. Duke's story reminds us that reaching out, whether through a fence or across the isolation of later life, can still change everything. Join the conversation. Have you ever found unexpected purpose during a time when you thought your meaningful contributions were behind you? What Duke in your life reminded you that age is just a number when it comes to making a difference?